Foundational Black American Identity, Covenant, and the Hidden History of a People by journalist Jonel Farmer, Cleveland. Ohio Table of Contents, Part 1, Identity and Erasure, Do the Lost Identity, Africa. Land of Many Nations, The Renaming of a People, Negro, Colored, Black, African American, Historical Suppression of Identity, Part 2. Biblical Origins, The Sons of Noah, Ham, and the Early Nations, Egypt and the Ancient World, Israelites, and Early Civilization, Biblical Genealogies, Part 3. Cycles of Captivity, Egypt and the First Bondage, Assyrian Captivity, Babylonian Captivity, Persian Rule, Greek Oppression, Roman Domination, Part 4. The Diaspora, the Destruction of Jerusalem, the Flight into Africa, Jewish Communities in West Africa, Timbuktu, and the Hebrew Influence, Migration Patterns Across the Sahara, Part 5. Empires of West Africa, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Jewish Families of West Africa, Cultural Traditions, Part 6. The Slave Trade, Early Slave Markets, European Expansion, African Kingdoms, and the Trade, Igbo and Israelite Traditions, the Transatlantic Slave System, Part 7. The Covenant, Moses, and the Covenant Blessings of Obedience, Curses of Disobedience, Deuteronomy 28. The Theology of Punishment, Part 8. Modern Identity, Civil Rights Leaders, Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr. Modern Identity Movements, Part 9. Prophecy and Interpretation, Biblical Prophecy, Revelation, and the End Times, the 144,000 Restoration of Israel, Part 10. The Future, Return to Faith, Cultural Restoration, The Final Covenant, Chapter 1. The Lost Identity Across the Vast Continent of Africa. There are more than 47 nations and nearly 1,500 languages spoken among its many peoples. Yet the story of people of African descent in the Americas has often been reduced to a single narrative beginning in the 17th century with the transatlantic slave trade. For many generations, the historical memory of millions of people was interrupted. Families were separated, languages were lost, and ancestral traditions were stripped away under the institution of slavery. In the centuries that followed, new labels were applied to these populations: Negro, Colored, Black, and eventually African American. Each name reflected not only a change in language but also a shift in identity. The question of origin has long been a matter of debate among historians, theologians, and scholars. Some traditions draw connections between biblical narratives and the historical experiences of people of African descent in the Americas. These interpretations often center on the ancient history of Israel, the migrations of peoples after the destruction of Jerusalem, and the scattering of communities across Africa and beyond. Throughout history, communities have attempted to understand their place in the world by looking to religious texts, archaeological discoveries, and oral traditions. For many believers, the Bible serves not only as a spiritual guide but also as a historical record of nations, migrations, and covenants. One of the earliest genealogical narratives in the biblical tradition begins with the story of Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. According to biblical accounts, these families became the ancestors of many nations following the Great Flood. Some scholars and interpreters have associated the descendants of Ham with ancient civilizations such as Egypt, Ethiopia, Libya, and Canaan. These civilizations played major roles in shaping the early world through architecture, trade, religion, and governance. The history of ancient peoples is complex and often debated. Archaeology, anthropology, linguistics, and theology all contribute pieces to the puzzle. Yet for communities searching for their origins, the deeper issue is not merely academic, it is personal. Identity shapes how people understand themselves, their history, and their destiny. For descendants of enslaved Africans in the Americas, the search for identity has often been complicated by centuries of displacement and forced assimilation. Records were destroyed, languages forgotten, and family lines broken. Despite these obstacles, the search continues. Some look to Africa as the cradle of their ancestry. Others examine biblical traditions and diaspora histories that connect ancient Israelite communities to regions of North and West Africa. Scholars have documented Jewish communities in places such as Ethiopia, North Africa, and parts of West Africa for centuries. These histories remind us that migration, trade, conquest, and cultural exchange have always shaped human civilization. The challenge today is separating historical evidence, religious belief, and political interpretation while recognizing the complexity of the past. For many, the question remains, who are we, and where do we truly come from? Foundational Black American Identity, Covenant, and the Hidden History of a People by journalist Jonel Farmer, Cleveland, Ohio. Chapter 2, Africa. Land of nations and languages. Africa is often described as a single place, but in reality it is one of the most culturally diverse regions on Earth. There are over 47 countries and nearly 1,500 languages spoken across the continent. Each nation contains its own customs, religions, traditions, and historical narratives. For centuries, Western education systems simplified Africa into a single cultural identity. This simplification erased the complex civilizations that existed across the continent long before European exploration. Ancient Africa contained powerful kingdoms and empires. These included Nubia, Kush, Egypt, Aksum, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. These societies built trade networks, universities, cities, and systems of government. Cities such as Timbuktu became famous for scholarship and learning. Libraries contained manuscripts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and theology. The image that Africa was an uncivilized land before colonial contact is historically inaccurate. Archaeological and historical evidence shows that Africa played a central role in global history. Trade routes connected Africa with Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Gold, salt, ivory, textiles, and agricultural products were traded across vast distances. Many ethnic groups lived across these regions, including the Yoruba, Hausa, Fulani, Mandinka, Igbo, Berbers, and many others. Each group possessed its own language and spiritual traditions. Understanding this diversity is essential when examining the ancestry of people brought to the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade. Those taken into slavery did not come from one single tribe or culture, but from many different regions across West and Central Africa. Because of this, tracing exact ancestry for descendants of enslaved people has been difficult. Centuries of forced migration disrupted family histories and erased many records. However, oral traditions, religious texts, and historical writings have preserved fragments of these stories. Chapter 3, The Renaming of a People Language, has always been a powerful tool in shaping identity. Throughout American history, people of African descent were given different labels depending on the social and political climate of the time. During the era of slavery, the term Negro was widely used. This word originated from Latin and Spanish roots meaning black. Later, the term colored became common during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. By the mid-20th century, the civil rights movement encouraged the use of the word black as a symbol of pride and resistance. In the late 20th century, the term African American emerged as a way to connect identity to ancestral heritage. Each of these names represented more than vocabulary. They reflected how society viewed a population and how that population viewed itself. Names influence perception. When people are repeatedly renamed, their connection to their past can become blurred. For many descendants of enslaved people in the Americas, the search for identity has involved examining history beyond the traditional narratives taught in school. Some scholars explore connections between African diaspora communities and ancient cultures mentioned in religious texts. Others rely on anthropology, genetics, and archaeology to reconstruct lost histories. The truth about ancestry is often complex and multifaceted. Human migration has always been part of the story of civilization. Chapter for the Bible and historical narratives. Religious texts have played an important role in shaping how people interpret history. For millions of believers around the world, the Bible is not only a spiritual guide but also a historical document. Biblical genealogies describe the descendants of early patriarchs and the formation of ancient nations. According to the book of Genesis, Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Their descendants were believed to populate different regions after the flood. Some interpretations connect the descendants of Ham with ancient African and Near Eastern civilizations such as Egypt, Ethiopia, Libya, and Canaan. These interpretations have influenced religious discussions about the origins of various populations. Scholars throughout history have debated how these biblical narratives should be understood. Some interpret them symbolically, while others read them as literal history. During the 19th century, scientists and historians attempted to classify human populations using physical measurements such as skull size and facial structure. These early studies were often influenced by racial theories that modern scholars now consider flawed or biased. Today, historians emphasize a broader approach that combines archaeology, linguistics, and cultural study to better understand ancient societies. Despite these debates, religious traditions remain a powerful source of identity and meaning for many communities. Foundational Black American Identity, Covenant, and the Hidden History of a People by journalist Jonel Farmer, Cleveland, Ohio. Chapter 5, The Ancient World and Early Civilizations. Long before the modern era, civilizations rose and fell across the ancient world. The regions surrounding the Nile River, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Middle East became centers of early human development. Agriculture, written language, and organized government emerged in these places thousands of years ago. Ancient Egypt stands among the most well-known of these early civilizations. Located along the fertile banks of the Nile River, Egypt developed monumental architecture, complex religious traditions, and advanced systems of mathematics and engineering. Pyramids, temples, and tombs still stand today as evidence of this civilization's power. Egypt was not isolated. It traded and interacted with surrounding regions including Nubia, Libya, Canaan, and Mesopotamia. Through these connections, ideas and cultural traditions spread across continents. Ancient records show that people moved constantly throughout the Mediterranean and African worlds. Migration, trade, warfare, and alliances brought different populations into contact with one another. Understanding these movements is important when examining the development of ancient peoples and their descendants. Many historians emphasize that civilizations in Africa and the Near East were deeply interconnected. Cultural exchange shaped language, religion, art, and governance. These connections would eventually play a role in the later migrations and diasporas described in both historical records and religious traditions. Chapter 6, The Kingdom of Israel. According to biblical narratives, the Israelites emerged as a distinct people in the ancient Near East. Their story begins with patriarchs such as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob, later called Israel, became the father of 12 tribes. These tribes formed the early Israelite nation. Biblical texts describe how the Israelites spent generations in Egypt before being led out of bondage by Moses. This event, known as the Exodus, became one of the most central stories in the religious tradition of Judaism and Christianity. After leaving Egypt, the Israelites traveled through the wilderness and eventually settled in the land of Canaan. Over time, the tribes formed a united kingdom under leaders such as Saul, David, and Solomon. Jerusalem became the capital, and the temple served as the center of religious life. However, the unity of the kingdom did not last. After Solomon's reign, the kingdom divided into two regions, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. This division weakened the nation and made it vulnerable to foreign empires. Chapter 7, The Assyrian Captivity. The rise of the Assyrian Empire dramatically changed the political landscape of the ancient Near East. Known for its powerful army and expansionist policies, Assyria conquered many neighboring nations. In 722 BCE, the Assyrian king captured Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. According to the biblical record in 2 Kings, many Israelites were taken into captivity and relocated throughout the Assyrian Empire. This event became known as the Assyrian Captivity. The displacement of these communities marked one of the earliest large-scale dispersions of the Israelites. Historians often refer to the lost tribes of Israel when discussing these populations. Over time, some groups assimilated into other cultures while others maintained traditions connected to their original heritage. Migration patterns from this period remain a topic of scholarly debate. Chapter 8, Babylon and Exile after the fall of the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom of Judah continued for more than a century. However, another empire soon rose to power. Babylon, under King Nebuchadnezzar II, conquered Jerusalem in 586 BCE. The city and temple were destroyed, and many inhabitants were taken into exile in Babylon. This period, known as the Babylonian captivity, lasted several decades. Despite the hardship of exile, the Israelites preserved many of their religious traditions during this time. Prophets, scribes, and teachers helped maintain cultural identity. Later, when the Persian Empire conquered Babylon, some Israelites were allowed to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. This restoration marked an important chapter in their history. Chapter 9, Greek rule and cultural change centuries later. The expansion of the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great brought major cultural transformation to the region. Greek language, philosophy, and customs spread across the eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. After Alexander's death, his empire divided among several rulers. One of these dynasties controlled the region that included Jerusalem. During this period, tensions grew between traditional religious practices and the influence of Greek culture. Historical texts describe conflicts that led to revolts and attempts to preserve religious identity. These struggles shaped Jewish culture and religious life in the centuries leading up to the Roman period. Chapter 10, Roman conquest. By the 1st century BCE, the Roman Empire had become the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. Roman armies eventually conquered Jerusalem, bringing the region under imperial control. Political unrest and revolts followed. In 70 CE, Roman forces destroyed Jerusalem and the Second Temple during a major uprising. This event marked one of the most significant turning points in Jewish history. Large numbers of people fled or were dispersed throughout different regions of the world. This dispersion contributed to the formation of Jewish diaspora communities across North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Foundational Black American Identity, Covenant, and the Hidden History of a People by journalist Jonel Farmer, Cleveland. Ohio. Chapter 11, The Destruction of Jerusalem in the First Century of the Common Era. Tensions between the Roman Empire and the Jewish population of Judea reached a breaking point. Roman taxation, political interference, and religious tensions created widespread unrest. Rebellion eventually erupted. In the year 70 CE, Roman forces under General Titus surrounded the city of Jerusalem. After a long siege, the city fell to the Roman army. The destruction was devastating. The Second Temple, which had served as the central place of worship for the Jewish people, was burned and destroyed. Ancient historical records describe mass casualties, displacement, and captivity. Thousands were killed, while many others were forced into slavery throughout the Roman Empire. The fall of Jerusalem marked a major turning point in Jewish history. It triggered the scattering of communities into many different regions of the world. This event contributed to what historians call the Jewish diaspora. Chapter 12, The Flight into Africa. After the destruction of Jerusalem, many Jewish communities migrated to regions where Roman authority was weaker. Historical writings suggest that some groups traveled south into North Africa. These migrations connected the Jewish diaspora to regions that included Egypt, Libya, and other areas along the Mediterranean coast. Over time, some communities continued migrating farther inland. Trade routes across the Sahara Desert connected North Africa with West African kingdoms. Merchants, travelers, and scholars traveled these routes for centuries. Through these routes, cultural and religious traditions moved across the continent. Several historical accounts describe Jewish communities existing in parts of North and West Africa long before the European colonial era. These communities maintained religious customs, laws, and traditions that reflected ancient Hebrew practices. Chapter 13, Jewish Communities of North Africa. North Africa has long been home to Jewish communities. Historical records show Jewish populations living in regions such as Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco for many centuries. Some communities developed after migrations from the Middle East, while others formed through trade networks and cultural exchanges. These communities maintained synagogues, schools, and religious traditions that connected them to the broader Jewish world. In some places, Jewish merchants played important roles in trade between Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. Their presence helped establish commercial networks that crossed deserts and seas. Because of these connections, ideas and traditions moved between distant regions. Chapter 14, The Road to Timbuktu. One of the most famous centers of learning in West Africa was the city of Timbuktu. Located in present-day Mali, Timbuktu became an important center for trade and scholarship between the 13th and 16th centuries. Merchants traveling through the Sahara Desert carried gold, salt, manuscripts, and other goods between North Africa and West Africa. The city became known for its libraries and schools. Scholars studied subjects such as astronomy, mathematics, law, and theology. Many manuscripts from this period still exist today, demonstrating the intellectual traditions that flourished in the region. Because Timbuktu was connected to major trade routes, people from many cultures passed through the city. These exchanges contributed to the spread of ideas across the African continent. Chapter 15, West African Empires. Between the 8th and 16th centuries, powerful empires developed across West Africa. Among the most prominent were the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, and the Songhai Empire. These states controlled important trade routes that connected West Africa with North Africa and the Mediterranean world. Gold from West Africa became one of the most valuable commodities in global trade. Kings and rulers established systems of taxation and administration that allowed these empires to prosper. Cities such as Gao, Jen, and Timbuktu became centers of commerce and learning. These societies demonstrated the political and economic sophistication of West African civilizations long before European colonization. Chapter 16, Cultural Traditions and Identity. West Africa contained hundreds of ethnic groups, each with its own language, customs, and spiritual traditions. Groups such as the Yoruba, Hausa, Fulani, Mandinka, and Igbo developed unique cultural identities that shaped their communities. Some historians have noted similarities between certain West African customs and practices found in other parts of the world. These similarities sometimes include traditions related to marriage, burial practices, dietary rules, and religious ceremonies. However, scholars emphasize that cultural parallels can emerge through trade, migration, and shared human experiences. Understanding cultural identity requires careful study of history, anthropology, and archaeology. Chapter 17, The Transatlantic Slave Trade beginning in the 15th century. European exploration of the Atlantic Ocean led to the creation of new trade networks. Portuguese sailors were among the first Europeans to establish trading posts along the West African coast. At first, trade focused on goods such as gold, ivory, and spices. Over time, however, enslaved labor became a major part of the system. European merchants transported enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to colonies in the Americas. This system became known as the transatlantic slave trade. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, millions of Africans were forcibly transported across the ocean under brutal conditions. Families were separated and communities disrupted. The consequences of this system continue to shape societies today. Chapter 18, Life in the Americas. Enslaved Africans brought to the Americas were forced to work on plantations, mines, and farms. They cultivated crops such as cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugar. Despite harsh conditions, enslaved people preserved elements of their culture through music, religion, language, and storytelling. These traditions influenced the development of many cultures across the Americas. Over generations, new communities formed as people adapted to life under slavery. Their descendants would eventually play major roles in shaping the history and culture of the United States and other nations in the Western Hemisphere. Chapter 19, The Search for Identity after slavery ended in the 19th century. Descendants of enslaved Africans began searching for ways to reconnect with their heritage. Historians, religious leaders, and activists explored different interpretations of history and identity. Some emphasized connections to African cultures and traditions. Others examined religious narratives that connected their history to biblical stories. The search for identity became an important part of cultural and political movements during the 20th century. Chapter 20, Remembering the Past, Understanding History, is essential for understanding the present. The stories of migration, displacement, and resilience that shaped the African diaspora continue to influence the modern world. Scholars, historians, and communities continue researching the origins and experiences of people whose ancestors were affected by slavery and colonialism. Their work helps preserve historical memory and encourages deeper conversations about identity and heritage. Foundational Black American Identity, Covenant, and the Hidden History of a People by journalist Jonel Farmer, Cleveland, Ohio. Chapter 21, Covenant and Responsibility. One of the most important ideas in the Hebrew Bible is the concept of a covenant. In biblical tradition, a covenant represents an agreement between God and a people. It is not simply a contract, but a sacred relationship involving responsibility, obedience, and faith. The story of the covenant between God and the Israelites is central to much of the Old Testament narrative. According to the biblical account, after leading the Israelites out of Egypt, Moses brought the people to Mount Sinai. There, the people entered into an agreement with God. This covenant involved a set of laws and commandments that were intended to guide the nation. These laws addressed worship, justice, moral behavior, and community life. For believers, the covenant represented both privilege and responsibility. The people believed they had been chosen for a special relationship with God, but that relationship required obedience. Chapter 22, Blessings and Consequences. Biblical texts describe the covenant as containing both promises and warnings. If the people followed the commandments, they would experience blessings such as prosperity, protection, and peace. However, disobedience was believed to bring consequences. These ideas appear clearly in the book of Deuteronomy, where blessings and curses are described in detail. The text explains that obedience would lead to success and security, while disobedience could lead to suffering, defeat, or exile. Throughout biblical history, prophets often interpreted national disasters as signs that the people had turned away from their covenant obligations. Whether these interpretations are understood as theological explanations or historical reflections depends largely on personal belief and religious perspective. Chapter 23, Prophets and Warnings. Prophets played a major role in ancient Israelite society. These individuals were believed to deliver messages from God to the people. Their messages often called for repentance and reform. Prophets warned that injustice, corruption, and idolatry would lead to national decline. They urged leaders and citizens alike to return to the laws and principles of the covenant. Figures such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel became central voices during periods of crisis in Israelite history. Their writings continue to influence religious thought today. Many believers interpret these prophetic messages as timeless lessons about justice, faithfulness, and responsibility. Chapter 24, Exile as a Religious Interpretation. The concept of exile appears repeatedly in biblical history. When the Israelites were conquered by foreign empires, many religious leaders interpreted these events through the lens of covenant theology. According to this perspective, suffering and displacement were seen as consequences of national disobedience. This interpretation shaped the way many ancient communities understood historical events. At the same time, the prophets also spoke about restoration. They predicted that one day the people would return from exile and rebuild their communities. These promises of restoration provided hope during difficult periods. Chapter 25, The Power of Scripture. For centuries, sacred texts have played a central role in shaping how communities interpret their history. The Bible, Torah, and other religious writings have been studied by scholars, priests, rabbis, pastors, and believers across the world. Different traditions interpret these texts in different ways. Some view them primarily as spiritual guidance. Others see them as historical narratives that record the experiences of ancient peoples. Still others combine both perspectives. Regardless of interpretation, these writings have influenced laws, cultures, and societies for thousands of years. Chapter 26, Religion and Identity. Religion has often served as a powerful foundation for identity. Communities throughout history have used religious traditions to define their values, customs, and sense of belonging. For people whose ancestors experienced slavery and displacement, religion sometimes became a way to interpret suffering and maintain hope. Biblical stories of liberation, such as the Exodus from Egypt, became especially meaningful in communities seeking freedom and justice. Spiritual songs, sermons, and teachings frequently drew parallels between ancient narratives and modern struggles. These interpretations helped sustain faith and resilience during difficult times. Chapter 27, The Legacy of Slavery. The transatlantic slave trade lasted for several centuries and had profound consequences for millions of people. Entire societies were reshaped by forced labor systems, racial hierarchies, and economic exploitation. The legacy of slavery continued long after legal abolition. In the United States, formerly enslaved people and their descendants faced segregation, discrimination, and political exclusion. Despite these challenges, African American communities built institutions such as churches, schools, and businesses that helped strengthen social and cultural life. These institutions became centers of leadership and activism. Chapter 28, Movements for Justice. Throughout American history, many leaders emerged who worked to advance civil rights and equality. Figures such as Marcus Garvey, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X offered different visions for progress. Some promoted economic independence and cultural pride. Others emphasized nonviolent protest and political reform. Although their strategies differed, they all sought to improve the conditions of African Americans and secure greater justice. Their ideas continue to influence discussions about identity, empowerment, and social change. Chapter 29, Re-examining History. In recent decades, historians and scholars have increasingly examined previously overlooked aspects of history. Research into the African diaspora, archaeology, and genetics has helped expand understanding of the past. New discoveries continue to challenge earlier assumptions. Historical scholarship now emphasizes the importance of multiple perspectives when studying the experiences of different communities. By examining historical documents, oral traditions, and cultural practices, researchers attempt to build a more complete picture of the past. Chapter 30, Looking Toward the Future. The search for identity is an ongoing journey. For many people, understanding their heritage involves exploring history, culture, faith, and family traditions. Learning about the past can help communities better understand the present and shape the future. Education, dialogue, and continued research remain essential in uncovering the complex stories that make up human history. By examining historical experiences honestly and thoughtfully, societies can move toward greater understanding and unity. Foundational Black American Identity, Covenant, and the Hidden History of a People by journalist Jonel Farmer, Cleveland, Ohio. Chapter 31, Prophecy and Historical Interpretation. Throughout history, many communities have interpreted major historical events through the lens of prophecy. Religious texts often contain passages that believers connect to events occurring in their own time. In the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, prophetic writings speak about exile, suffering, restoration, and the eventual establishment of a just kingdom. These passages have been studied for centuries by theologians, historians, and religious leaders. Different traditions interpret these prophecies in different ways. Some view them as symbolic teachings about morality and justice. Others see them as literal predictions about future events. Regardless of interpretation, prophetic literature continues to influence religious thought and social movements around the world. Chapter 32, The Book of Revelation. One of the most widely discussed prophetic texts in Christian scripture is the Book of Revelation. This book contains vivid imagery and symbolic language describing conflict between forces of good and evil divine judgment. and the ultimate restoration of justice. Many believers interpret Revelation as a message of hope. Despite the turmoil described in the text, the story ultimately points toward renewal and the establishment of peace. Throughout history, people have attempted to identify the political powers or historical periods referenced in the text. However, interpretations vary widely among scholars and religious traditions. Chapter 33, The Idea of a Remnant. Another recurring theme in biblical literature is the concept of a remnant. This idea appears in several prophetic books. According to this concept, even during periods of great suffering or national decline, a faithful group remains committed to the covenant and its teachings. Prophets often describe this remnant as the group that would carry forward the traditions and eventually witness restoration. For many believers, the idea of a remnant symbolizes perseverance and faith during difficult times. It reminds communities that even when institutions collapse or societies change, spiritual traditions can survive. Chapter 34, Restoration and Renewal. Biblical prophecy frequently moves from warning to hope. After describing hardship or exile, many prophetic texts promise a future restoration. In these passages, the scattered people are gathered again, justice is restored, and peace returns. These themes of renewal have inspired countless movements throughout history. Communities experiencing oppression or displacement often draw strength from promises of future restoration. These messages emphasize perseverance and faith during times of struggle. Chapter 35, The Global Diaspora. Today, people of African descent live throughout the world. The African diaspora includes communities in North America, South America, Europe, the Caribbean, and many other regions. Each of these communities has developed unique cultures shaped by history, migration, and local traditions. Music, language, religion, and art all reflect the blending of different influences. Despite geographical separation, many diaspora communities share a common historical experience rooted in the transatlantic slave trade. Understanding this shared history helps connect communities across national and cultural boundaries. Chapter 36, Cultural Resilience. One of the most remarkable aspects of diaspora history is cultural resilience. Despite centuries of hardship, communities preserve traditions through storytelling, music, spiritual practices, and family customs. Spiritual songs, sermons, and religious gatherings played an especially important role in sustaining hope. Churches often served as centers of community life where education, organization, and activism took place. These institutions helped build the foundation for later social movements. Chapter 37, Education and Empowerment. Education has long been recognized as a powerful tool for empowerment. After the abolition of slavery, many newly freed communities prioritized building schools and literacy programs. Education allowed individuals to participate more fully in civic life and advocate for their rights. Historically, black colleges and universities also played major roles in training future leaders, educators, and professionals. These institutions continue to shape American society today. Chapter 38, The Civil Rights Era. The 20th century brought major social and political changes in the United States. The civil rights movement challenged segregation and racial discrimination through protests, legal action, and public advocacy. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and organizations across the country helped push for legislative reforms. These efforts led to major milestones, including the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Although progress was made, debates about equality and justice continue today. Chapter 39, Modern Conversations about Identity in the Modern World. Conversations about identity are increasingly complex. Advances in genealogy, DNA testing, and historical research have allowed individuals to explore their ancestry in new ways. Many people discover connections to multiple regions and cultures. These discoveries often reveal the deep interconnectedness of human history. Identity can include elements of heritage, culture, faith, and personal experience. Because of this complexity, discussions about identity require openness, dialogue, and careful study. Chapter 40, Looking Ahead. The story of identity is never fully finished. Each generation continues the work of researching history, preserving traditions, and building new cultural expressions. Understanding the past provides valuable lessons for the future. It reminds societies of the importance of justice, compassion, and respect for human dignity. By studying history honestly and thoughtfully, communities can move toward a more informed and united future. Foundational Black American Identity, Covenant, and the Hidden History of a People by journalist Jonel Farmer, Cleveland. Ohio Chapter 41. Faith in the modern world. Religion continues to shape the lives of millions of people around the world. For many communities, faith provides guidance, hope, and a sense of connection to history. Within African American communities, churches and spiritual institutions have historically played an important role not only in worship, but also in education, activism, and social organization. These institutions served as places where people gathered to discuss challenges facing their communities and to plan strategies for progress. Faith traditions helped sustain resilience during periods of oppression and social struggle. Chapter 42. Interpreting Ancient Texts. Today, sacred texts such as the Bible have been studied for centuries, and interpretations have evolved over time. Modern scholars often examine these writings using multiple disciplines including history, archaeology, linguistics, and theology. This approach allows researchers to better understand the cultural context in which ancient texts were written. For believers, Scripture continues to serve as a guide for moral values and spiritual reflection. For historians, it also provides insight into how ancient societies understood their world. Chapter 43. Identity. In the age of information in the 21st century, information travels faster than at any other time in human history. Books, digital archives, and online databases allow people to research their ancestry and cultural history in ways that were not possible in previous generations. Genealogy research, DNA analysis, and historical documentation have opened new paths for understanding family history. These tools have helped many individuals reconnect with aspects of their heritage that had previously been lost. At the same time, the abundance of information requires careful evaluation of sources and evidence. Chapter 44. Global Cultural Connections. The African diaspora has contributed significantly to global culture. Music genres such as jazz, blues, gospel, reggae, and hip-hop have influenced artistic expression around the world. Literature, philosophy, and visual arts created by African American thinkers have also shaped intellectual discussions about freedom, justice, and identity. These contributions demonstrate how cultural creativity can emerge even from difficult historical circumstances. They also highlight the interconnected nature of modern global society. Chapter 45. Education and Historical Awareness. Understanding history is essential for building informed communities. Schools, universities, museums, and cultural institutions all play roles in preserving historical knowledge. Scholars continue to examine archival records, archaeological discoveries, and oral histories in order to reconstruct the experiences of past generations. Through education, younger generations gain the tools needed to analyze the past and contribute to future scholarship. Historical awareness encourages critical thinking and deeper appreciation for cultural diversity. Chapter 46. Community and Leadership. Leadership within communities often emerges through service, education, and dedication to collective progress. Throughout history, community leaders have organized movements for justice, equality, and cultural preservation. Figures such as Marcus Garvey, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X offered different visions for empowerment and social transformation. Their ideas continue to inspire debates about economic independence, political participation, and cultural pride. Leadership remains essential in addressing modern challenges and building stronger communities. Chapter 47. Cultural Memory. Cultural memory refers to the ways societies remember and transmit their history. This memory is preserved through stories, music, traditions, and written records. For descendants of the African diaspora, cultural memory includes both painful histories and powerful achievements. Remembering these experiences helps ensure that the sacrifices and struggles of earlier generations are not forgotten. It also strengthens cultural identity and solidarity. Chapter 48a, Continuing Journey. The exploration of identity is not a single moment of discovery, but a lifelong journey. Every generation re-examines its past in order to better understand the present. New research, new perspectives, and new discoveries continue to expand our knowledge of human history. By studying history with honesty and curiosity, individuals can gain deeper appreciation for the complexity of their heritage. Chapter 49, Lessons from History. History offers valuable lessons about power, resilience, and the consequences of injustice. Societies that examine their past critically are better equipped to avoid repeating harmful patterns. The study of slavery, migration, and cultural exchange helps reveal how interconnected human civilizations have always been. Learning from these experiences encourages empathy and cooperation across cultural boundaries. Chapter 50, The Future of Identity. The future of identity will likely continue to evolve as societies change. Advances in technology, communication, and research will provide new insights into ancestry and history. At the same time, communities will continue to shape their identities through culture, faith, and shared experiences. The story of identity is ultimately a story of people, how they remember their past, understand their present, and imagine their future. Conclusion. Remembering, learning, and moving forward. The history of people of African descent in the Americas is complex and multifaceted. It includes stories of suffering, resistance, creativity, and resilience. Understanding this history requires careful study of many sources: historical documents, archaeological evidence, cultural traditions, and religious texts. Each perspective contributes a piece to the larger narrative. By continuing to explore these histories, scholars and communities alike can deepen their understanding of identity and heritage. The search for knowledge does not end with a single book. Instead, it continues through research, dialogue, and education. Only by studying the past thoughtfully can societies build a future grounded in truth, understanding, and respect. Foundational Black American Identity, Covenant, and the Hidden History of a People by journalist Jonel Farmer, Cleveland, Ohio. Forward. History is not simply a collection of dates and events. It is the story of people, how they lived, how they struggled, and how they understood their place in the world. For many communities, history is preserved in written records, oral traditions, and religious teachings passed down through generations. Yet there are also moments when history becomes fragmented. Wars, migrations, colonization, and slavery have the power to disrupt historical memory. The story of people of African descent in the Americas represents one of the most complex historical experiences in modern history. Millions were taken from their homes during the transatlantic slave trade, transported across the Atlantic Ocean, and forced into systems of labor that shaped the development of the modern world. The consequences of this history remain visible today in culture, politics, religion, and social structures. Throughout the centuries that followed, scholars, religious leaders, and historians have attempted to reconstruct the identities and origins of these communities. Some approaches rely on archaeology and anthropology. Others draw from religious texts and spiritual traditions. This book explores one interpretation of that history, one that examines the relationship between biblical narratives, historical migrations, and the experiences of people of African descent in the Americas. While interpretations may differ among scholars and readers, the search for identity remains a powerful force that continues to shape communities today. Author's introduction by Jonel Farmer. Growing up in Cleveland, I often heard different explanations about the history of Black people in America. Schools taught one narrative. Churches sometimes taught another. Books and independent researchers presented still other interpretations. Over time, I began to notice that many people were asking the same question: who are we really? The history of African Americans is usually taught beginning with the 1600s and the arrival of enslaved Africans in North America. But many researchers argue that the story begins much earlier. The history of ancient civilizations, migrations, and biblical traditions has led some scholars and religious groups to explore connections between the African diaspora and ancient peoples mentioned in religious texts. This book does not claim to solve every historical question. Instead, it presents a journey through history, scripture, and cultural memory. It invites readers to examine sources, study history, and explore the deeper questions of identity and heritage. The search for truth requires curiosity, open-mindedness, and careful research. This book represents part of that journey. Chapter 1: The Lost Identity Across the Vast Continent of Africa. There are more than 47 countries and nearly 1,500 languages spoken by its many peoples. Each region has its own history, traditions, and cultural identities. Yet when people of African descent in the Americas attempt to trace their ancestry, they often encounter a problem. Their historical trail seems to stop abruptly around the time of the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of enslaved people were brought to the Americas between the 16th and 19th centuries. During this process, families were separated, languages were suppressed, and cultural identities were often erased. Slave traders rarely recorded detailed information about the individuals they transported. Instead, people were often grouped together simply as cargo. Because of this, many descendants of enslaved Africans today struggle to trace their ancestry beyond a few generations. The loss of historical identity created a vacuum. In that vacuum, different interpretations of history emerged. Some scholars emphasize connections to specific regions of West and Central Africa. Others explore possible links between the African diaspora and ancient civilizations described in historical or religious texts. The search for identity has therefore become both historical and spiritual. For many people, the question is not simply about geography, but about heritage, culture, and purpose. Names also played a major role in shaping identity. During slavery and segregation, people of African descent in the United States were referred to by many different terms: Negro, colored, black, and eventually African American. Each of these names reflected social and political conditions of the time, but names can also influence how people understand themselves. When a population is renamed repeatedly across generations, its connection to earlier identity can become blurred. The question of origin becomes more complicated. Was their heritage tied to specific African cultures? Was it connected to ancient civilizations? Or was it part of a broader global diaspora? These questions have led researchers to explore a wide range of historical sources, including archaeology, anthropology, linguistics, and religious texts. Religious writings in particular have played a major role in shaping identity narratives. For millions of believers around the world, the Bible provides not only spiritual teachings but also genealogies and historical accounts of ancient peoples. These narratives describe migrations, kingdoms, wars, and covenants between God and nations. Because of this, some communities have examined biblical history as part of their search for identity. The exploration of identity is rarely simple. Human history is filled with migration, cultural exchange, and shifting political boundaries. Understanding the past requires examining multiple perspectives. The story of the African diaspora is one of displacement but also of resilience. Despite centuries of hardship, communities preserved traditions, created new cultures, and built societies that continue to shape the modern world. The search for identity continues today through historical research, cultural study, and personal exploration. And with every new discovery, the story becomes more complex and more fascinating. Foundational Black American Identity, Covenant, and the Hidden History of a People by journalist Jonel Farmer, Cleveland. Ohio, copyright 2026 by Jonel Farmer, all rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, distributed, or transmitted in any form or by any means without prior written permission of the author, except in the case of brief quotations used in reviews or scholarly discussion. First edition published in the United States of America, ISBN, printed and distributed through Amazon Kindle Direct Publishing, dedication to the generations who came before us, those who endured slavery, displacement, and hardship. May their stories never be forgotten, and may future generations continue searching for truth, knowledge, and understanding. Author biography. Jonel Farmer is a journalist and independent researcher from Cleveland, Ohio. His work focuses on questions of identity, history, religion, and the historical experiences of people of African descent in the Americas. Through independent research and analysis of historical writings, religious texts, and cultural traditions, Farmer explores different interpretations of the origins and historical journey of Black Americans. Foundational Black American represents an effort to examine historical narratives, diaspora history, and biblical traditions that have influenced discussions about identity within the African American community. Expanded Chapter 2. Africa, Land of Nations and Languages. Africa is often described in simple terms, but in reality it is one of the most culturally diverse regions on Earth. The continent is home to dozens of modern nations and thousands of ethnic groups. Linguists estimate that more than 1,500 languages are spoken across Africa today. These languages belong to several major language families, including Afro-Asiatic, Niger-Congo, Nilo-Saharan, and Khoisan. Each language represents a unique cultural tradition with its own stories, histories, and systems of knowledge. When discussing the origins of people of African descent in the Americas, it is important to understand this diversity. The transatlantic slave trade did not take people from a single culture or nation. Instead, individuals were taken from many different regions along the western and central coasts of Africa. Among the ethnic groups most affected were the Yoruba, Igbo, Mandinka, Akan, Wolof, and many others. These communities possessed complex political systems and cultural traditions long before European contact. West Africa, in particular, was home to powerful empires that dominated regional trade for centuries. These included the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, and the Songhai Empire. These states controlled important trade routes connecting the gold fields of West Africa with markets in North Africa and the Mediterranean. Caravans traveled across the Sahara Desert carrying gold, salt, textiles, and manuscripts. Cities such as Timbuktu became centers of scholarship and commerce. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu attracted scholars from across the Islamic world. Libraries contained thousands of manuscripts on subjects including mathematics, astronomy, law, and philosophy. These achievements demonstrate that Africa possessed sophisticated intellectual traditions long before the colonial era. However, much of this history was overlooked or minimized in Western education systems during the 19th and 20th centuries. As a result, many students learn simplified or inaccurate narratives about African history. Modern scholarship continues to correct these misconceptions by examining archaeological discoveries, historical records, and oral traditions. Understanding the diversity and complexity of African civilizations is essential when exploring the ancestry of the African diaspora. Expanded Chapter 3. The Power of Names. Names have always carried deep social meaning. Throughout American history, the labels used to describe people of African descent changed several times. Each change reflected shifts in politics, culture, and social attitudes. During the era of slavery, the word Negro was widely used. The term originated from Latin and Spanish roots meaning black. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the term colored became common. Organizations such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People adopted the word as part of their official name. By the 1960s and 1970s, the civil rights movement encouraged the use of the word black as a symbol of pride and empowerment. Later, the term African American gained popularity as a way to emphasize cultural heritage and historical connection to Africa. Each term carried both political and cultural significance. For many people, the shifting terminology raised deeper questions about identity. Were the descendants of enslaved people primarily connected to African ancestry? Were their identities shaped more by their experiences in the Americas? Or were there deeper historical connections that had been lost over time? These questions continue to influence discussions about history and identity today. Foundational Black American Identity, Covenant, and the Hidden History of a People by journalist Jonel Farmer, Cleveland, Ohio. Chapter 4. Biblical Genealogies in the Ancient World. For thousands of years, religious texts have played an important role in shaping how people understand their history. Among these texts, the Bible contains genealogies that describe the descendants of early patriarchs and the formation of nations. One of the earliest genealogical accounts appears in the book of Genesis, following the story of the Great Flood. According to the narrative, Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These 3 family lines are traditionally described as the ancestors of many ancient nations. Biblical genealogies were not merely lists of names. They served several purposes within ancient societies. First, they helped communities preserve their historical memory. Second, they established connections between tribes and territories. Third, they reinforced religious beliefs about divine relationships with particular peoples. One widely discussed genealogy concerns the descendants of Ham. Biblical texts connect Ham's sons with regions that later became known as Egypt, Ethiopia, Libya, and Canaan. Ancient civilizations in these areas played important roles in the development of early human societies. Egypt, for example, became one of the most influential civilizations in the ancient world. Along the Nile River, Egyptians built cities, temples, and pyramids that continue to fascinate historians and archaeologists today. Their achievements in mathematics, engineering, medicine, and architecture influenced surrounding regions for centuries. However, interpreting biblical genealogies as direct historical maps of modern populations can be complicated. Ancient writers often used genealogies to describe political alliances, cultural relationships, and geographic regions rather than precise biological ancestry. Because of this, modern historians study these texts alongside archaeological evidence, linguistic research, and other historical sources. By combining these approaches, scholars attempt to reconstruct the movements and interactions of ancient peoples. Understanding these early narratives provides important context for later discussions about migration, diaspora, and cultural identity. Chapter 5. Egypt and the Early Israelite Narrative. Few civilizations have captured the imagination of historians as strongly as ancient Egypt. For over 3,000 years, Egyptian society flourished along the Nile River, developing one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history. Egyptian culture produced monumental architecture, complex religious traditions, and extensive written records preserved on papyrus and stone. Within biblical tradition, Egypt also occupies a central place in the story of the Israelites. According to the book of Exodus, the Israelites lived in Egypt for several generations before eventually leaving the land under the leadership of Moses. This event, known as the Exodus, became one of the foundational stories in Jewish and Christian religious traditions. The Exodus narrative describes how Moses led the Israelites out of bondage and into the wilderness, where they eventually formed a covenant with God. In this covenant, the people agreed to follow a set of laws and commandments that would guide their society. These laws addressed moral behavior, justice, religious worship, and community responsibilities. The covenant established the Israelites as a distinct community defined not only by ancestry, but also by shared religious obligations. Whether interpreted as literal history, symbolic narrative, or a combination of both, the story of the Exodus has had enormous influence. For many communities experiencing oppression throughout history, the Exodus story became a powerful symbol of liberation and divine justice. During the era of slavery in the United States, enslaved people often identified with the Israelites in bondage. Spiritual songs and sermons frequently referenced Moses and the journey toward freedom. The story provided hope that suffering could eventually lead to deliverance. Even today, the Exodus narrative continues to inspire movements seeking justice and equality. Chapter 6. The Kingdom of Israel and its division after the period of wandering described in the Exodus story. Biblical tradition describes the Israelites eventually establishing a kingdom in the land of Canaan. This kingdom reached its greatest unity during the reigns of King David and his son King Solomon. Jerusalem became the political and religious center of the nation, and the temple served as the central place of worship. However, following Solomon's death, political tensions led to a division of the kingdom. The northern region became known as Israel, while the southern region became known as Judah. This division weakened the nation and made it vulnerable to outside powers. In the centuries that followed, foreign empires would conquer both kingdoms, leading to periods of exile and dispersion that shaped Jewish history for generations. Foundational Black American Identity, Covenant, and the Hidden History of a People by journalist Jonel Farmer, Cleveland, Ohio. Chapter 7. The Assyrian Conquest during the 8th century BCE. The northern kingdom of Israel faced growing pressure from one of the most powerful empires of the ancient world, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians were known for their military strength and administrative organization. Their armies expanded across large portions of the Near East, conquering territories and integrating them into their empire. Around 722 BCE, Assyrian forces captured the capital city of Samaria. This conquest marked the end of the northern kingdom of Israel as an independent state. Historical records indicate that many inhabitants of the kingdom were deported and resettled in different parts of the Assyrian Empire. This practice was a common strategy used by Assyrian rulers. By relocating conquered populations, they reduced the likelihood of rebellion and encouraged cultural assimilation. The fate of these displaced groups later became the subject of many historical and religious discussions. Some traditions refer to these populations as the lost tribes of Israel. Scholars have debated the historical reality of this concept for centuries. Some researchers believe the deported populations gradually assimilated into surrounding cultures, while others suggest that some groups migrated to new regions and preserved aspects of their identity. Chapter 8. The Babylonian Exile. While the northern kingdom had already fallen to Assyria, the southern kingdom of Judah survived for several more generations. However, the rise of another empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, eventually brought new conflict to the region. In 586 BCE, Babylonian forces captured Jerusalem and destroyed the temple that had served as the central place of worship for the people of Judah. Large portions of the population were taken into captivity and relocated to Babylon. This period became known as the Babylonian Exile. The exile profoundly affected Jewish religious life and cultural identity. Without their temple or homeland, the exiled community developed new ways of preserving their traditions. Written texts, laws, and communal worship became increasingly important. Many scholars believe that significant portions of the Hebrew Scriptures were compiled or edited during this time. The experience of exile also strengthened themes of hope and restoration within biblical literature. Prophets spoke about the eventual return of the people to their homeland and the rebuilding of their society. Chapter 9. Migrations and cultural exchange. Throughout ancient history, migration was a common phenomenon. Wars, trade, climate changes, and political upheavals often forced populations to relocate. These movements created complex networks of cultural exchange. Archaeological evidence shows that ancient trade routes connected regions of the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Merchants transported goods such as gold, salt, textiles, spices, and ivory across long distances. Along with trade goods, ideas, and cultural practices also traveled between regions. Religious beliefs, artistic styles, and languages were influenced by these interactions. Because of these connections, historians study migration patterns carefully when examining the origins of different cultural communities. The movement of people across continents has always been part of human history. Chapter 10. The development of diaspora communities. The term diaspora refers to the scattering of a population from its original homeland. Throughout history, many groups have experienced diaspora as a result of war, trade, colonization, or economic migration. Jewish communities, for example, established settlements throughout the Mediterranean region following periods of exile. Over time, these communities adapted to local cultures while maintaining elements of their religious traditions. The African diaspora represents another major historical example. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, millions of Africans were transported across the Atlantic Ocean through the transatlantic slave trade. This forced migration created new communities in North America, the Caribbean, and South America. Despite enormous hardship, these communities preserved elements of their cultural heritage and created new forms of expression through music, language, and religion. The study of diaspora history helps historians understand how cultures survive and evolve across generations. Chapter 11, Scholarship and Historical Debate. The question of historical identity has attracted the attention of many scholars. Researchers from fields such as history, anthropology, archaeology, and theology have examined different aspects of the African diaspora and ancient migrations. Some authors have explored possible connections between African communities and biblical traditions. One example is the book From Babylon to Timbuktu by Rudolph R. Windsor. The author discusses theories regarding migrations of ancient Israelite groups into Africa. Another important scholar is Tudor Parfit, whose work Black Jews in Africa and the Americas examines Jewish communities of African descent and their historical development. These studies contribute to ongoing discussions about history, identity, and cultural memory. However, scholars often disagree about interpretations of historical evidence. Academic research emphasizes the importance of evaluating sources carefully and considering multiple perspectives. Debate and discussion are essential parts of historical scholarship. Through this process, historians gradually build a more complete understanding of the past, foundational Black American identity, covenant, and the hidden history of a people by journalist Jonel Farmer, Cleveland, Ohio. Chapter 12, Jewish Communities in Africa. Throughout history, Jewish communities have existed in many regions far beyond the Middle East. Historical records show that Jewish merchants, travelers, and migrants settled in parts of North Africa, East Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. In North Africa, Jewish communities were present in places such as Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria for centuries. Many of these communities developed during periods of trade between the Mediterranean world and the African interior. Jewish merchants often participated in long-distance trade networks that connected the Middle East with Africa and Europe. Through these networks, cultural and religious ideas also traveled across regions. In some areas, Jewish traditions blended with local cultures, creating unique expressions of religious life. These communities maintained religious practices such as Sabbath observance, dietary laws, and study of the Hebrew Scriptures. Over time, Jewish populations in Africa developed their own languages, customs, and interpretations of religious tradition. Chapter 13, The Ethiopian Jewish Tradition. One of the most well-known Jewish communities in Africa is the Ethiopian Jewish population, often referred to as the Beta Israel. For centuries, this community lived primarily in the highlands of Ethiopia. The origins of the Beta Israel community have been debated by historians. Some traditions trace their ancestry to ancient Israelites, while other scholars suggest that their religious practices developed within Ethiopia over time through contact with Jewish and Christian traditions. Regardless of their origins, the Beta Israel maintained distinctive religious practices that included observance of biblical laws, ritual purity traditions, and unique forms of worship. In the 20th century, many members of this community migrated to Israel through organized rescue and immigration missions. These events brought international attention to the long history of Jewish communities within Africa. The story of the Beta Israel illustrates how religious traditions can survive for centuries even in geographically isolated communities. Chapter 14, Medieval African Empires. While Jewish communities were developing in different regions of Africa, powerful African empires were also emerging across the continent. Among the most influential were the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, and the Songhai Empire. These states controlled major trade routes across West Africa and the Sahara Desert. Gold mined in West Africa was transported northward to Mediterranean markets, while salt from desert mines was traded southward to agricultural regions. This trade created immense wealth and supported the growth of major cities. One of the most famous cities of this era was Timbuktu, located in modern-day Mali. Timbuktu became known as a center of learning, attracting scholars from across Africa and the Islamic world. Manuscripts preserved in the region cover subjects such as astronomy, medicine, law, and theology. These intellectual traditions demonstrate that Africa possessed thriving centers of scholarship during the medieval period. Chapter 15: European Exploration and Global Expansion. Beginning in the 15th century, European nations began exploring new maritime routes beyond the Mediterranean world. One of the earliest participants in this exploration was Portugal. Portuguese sailors traveled along the western coast of Africa searching for new trade opportunities and access to valuable resources. These voyages gradually expanded European knowledge of the African coastline. Exploration soon led to the establishment of trading posts and commercial partnerships between European merchants and African kingdoms. Initially, trade focused on goods such as gold, ivory, spices, and textiles. However, over time, the nature of this trade began to change in ways that would have devastating consequences for millions of people. Chapter 16: The Beginning of the Transatlantic Slave Trade. By the 16th century, European colonial expansion in the Americas created a growing demand for labor. Plantations producing sugar, tobacco, and later cotton required large workforces. European colonists increasingly turned to the forced labor of enslaved Africans to meet this demand. The system that developed became known as the transatlantic slave trade. Over the course of several centuries, millions of Africans were captured, sold, and transported across the Atlantic Ocean. The journey across the ocean was known as the Middle Passage. Conditions on slave ships were extremely harsh, and many people did not survive the voyage. Those who did survive were sold into slavery in various parts of the Americas. This forced migration reshaped societies on both sides of the Atlantic. It disrupted African communities while simultaneously creating new cultural identities among the descendants of enslaved people in the Americas. The legacy of this history continues to influence social and cultural discussions today. Table of Contents: Foundational Black American Identity, Covenant, and the Hidden History of a People by Jonel Farmer. Front matter: Forward: Author's Introduction. Dedication. About the author. Part 1. Origins and Ancient History. The Lost Identity. Africa. Land of Nations and Languages. The Power of Names. Biblical Genealogies and the Ancient World. Egypt and the Early Israelite Narrative. The Kingdom of Israel and its Division. The Assyrian Conquest. The Babylonian Exile. Migrations and Cultural Exchange. The Development of Diaspora Communities. Part 2. Jewish Traditions in Africa. Scholarship and Historical Debate. Jewish Communities in Africa. The Ethiopian Jewish Tradition. Medieval African Empires. Trade Routes and Cultural Exchange. Early Contacts between Africa and Europe. Part 3. The Era of the Slave Trade. The Beginning of the Transatlantic Slave Trade. Capture and Enslavement in Africa. The Middle Passage. Life on the Plantation. Family Separation and Cultural Loss. Cultural Survival and Resistance. Religion and Spiritual Traditions among the Enslaved. Part 4. Freedom and Reconstruction. Abolition Movements. The American Civil War. Emancipation and the End of Slavery. Reconstruction and Political Participation. The Rise of Black Institutions. Education and the Founding of Schools. Part 5. Segregation and Civil Rights. The Era of Jim Crow. Migration to Northern Cities. Cultural Expression in the Early 20th Century. The Harlem Renaissance. Early Civil Rights Activism. The Civil Rights Movement. Leaders and Voices of Change. These chapters will include figures such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Part 6. Identity in the Modern Era. Black Cultural Identity in America. Religion and Community Life. Scholarship and Historical Reinterpretation. African Heritage and Genealogy. Faith in the Modern World. Interpreting Ancient Texts. Today. Identity in the Age of Information. Part 7. Culture, Memory, and the Future. Global Cultural Contributions. Education and Historical Awareness. Leadership and Community Development. Cultural Memory and Preservation. Continuing Journey Lessons from History, the Future of Identity, Amazon book, L description, Foundational Black American Identity Covenant, and The Hidden History of a People by Jonel Farmer, who are the foundational Black Americans. For centuries, the identity and history of Black Americans have been shaped by migration, struggle, cultural resilience, and faith. Yet many descendants of enslaved people still face a difficult question. Where does our story truly begin? In Foundational Black American, journalist Jonel Farmer explores historical narratives, diaspora history, and religious traditions that have influenced discussions about the origins and identity of Black Americans. Beginning with ancient civilizations and biblical history, this book traces the development of societies in Africa, the migrations of ancient peoples, and the emergence of communities across the African diaspora. It examines the rise of African empires, the impact of European exploration, and the devastating effects of the transatlantic slave trade. Through historical analysis and cultural reflection, the book also explores the struggles and achievements of Black communities in the Americas, from slavery and emancipation to the fight for civil rights and modern conversations about identity. This thought-provoking work invites readers to explore the intersections of history, faith, and cultural memory while asking deeper questions about heritage and belonging. Inside this book, you'll discover the diversity of ancient African civilizations' biblical narratives and their historical interpretations, the rise and influence of medieval African empires, the origins and impact of the transatlantic slave trade, cultural survival and resilience among enslaved communities, the rise of Black institutions and education in America, the struggle for civil rights and equality, modern discussions about heritage, identity, and diaspora history, a journey through history. Foundational Black American presents a wide-ranging exploration of the historical experiences that shaped the African diaspora in the Americas. By examining both historical research and cultural traditions, the book encourages readers to reflect on the complex and evolving story of identity. For readers interested in history, culture, and the ongoing search for identity, this book offers a compelling perspective on one of the most important historical journeys in the modern world. Author Jonel Farmer is a journalist and independent researcher from Cleveland, Ohio. His work focuses on history, identity, and cultural discussions within the African diaspora.